As Jenna said, I'm Jen Ray. I'm Associate Director of Programs at UNH's Sustainability Institute. The Sustainability Institute is the office at UNH that is charged with both making the campus more sustainable and with supporting educational programs around sustainability and supporting community partners in their efforts to be more sustainable. So there's an operational component, there's an educational component, and there's a community partnership component. And my role is to kind of set strategic direction and support the staff who implement all of those programs. I've been at the Institute um, since for more than 10 years, doing that variety of work. And before that was at a little climate change focused nonprofit working with colleges and universities and businesses and local governments on ways that they could understand their emissions and tackle those emissions as a way to kind of be the forward guard in tackling climate change more broadly and demonstrating that that's both economically feasible and good business and good community building. Um, that is the kind of the right thing to do on multiple levels. So that's a little bit about me. I'll pass it over to Ciara to introduce herself.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Michelle. I'm Ciara Tennis. I'm the SIMAP Program Coordinator at the UNH Sustainability Institute, and SIMAP is the carbon and nitrogen footprinting tool that we're talking about today. So what I do is I support users who are using SIMAP to complete their greenhouse gas inventories. We have multiple different types of institutions using SIMAP, multiple in higher ed, but also nonprofits, schools, and some businesses. So I have experience before joining the SIMAP team completing greenhouse gas inventories for a college, and then brought that me to SIMAP to help other institutions complete their inventories as well. And thank you so much for having us today.
Thanks, Ciara. So our plan for our presentation was to do that little bit of introducing you to us, give a very brief background on sort of how the SIMAP tool came to be and our experience with the kind of why and the what of carbon footprinting, then to do some kind of overview of some key terminology, some key concepts. And then because we heard in advance that many of you were really interested in talking about scope 3 specifically, those sort of upstream and downstream emissions, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about the methods for doing that quantification and kind of how it looks in SIMAP. And our plan is to be talking for about 20, 25 minutes, and then, as Jenna said, there should be time for questions. So that is our plan, and I will kick us off with some of that background. So I imagine that I'm preaching to the choir here in terms of the why do we care about carbon footprints, or what is the big idea? The big idea, kind of summed up in the sort of business maxim around you can't manage what you don't measure, is that we want to connect the dots between human behavior, whether that's individual or in organizations or cities or countries, with the science of climate change. And in doing that, we can pinpoint the biggest contributors and the most impactful opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas pollution and slowing climate change. So when we're talking about doing our carbon footprint, we're talking about doing an estimate of the greenhouse gas emissions from a specific entity over a defined period of time. And so at UNH, we have taken the idea of a carbon footprint very seriously for a long time. Back in the late 90s, when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, and the sort of debate at the time, the idea or question was, can the US afford to care about climate change or set or meet carbon reduction targets? Won't that impact our economy? So we were following that debate at UNH, and we were teaching students about climate change and management, business management. And so we decided that it would be useful to understand what would it mean for the university to meet the Kyoto Protocol's goals. This sort of idea of it's too expensive, it's too hard. Would it be for a university? So to tackle that, we first undertook to quantify our own campus footprint. And at the time, there weren't tools or standards for doing that. So we used guidance that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had created for countries who would potentially be part of the Kyoto Protocol. And we downscaled that guidance to try to be relevant to the sort of organizational level, an institution like UNH. So we did that in 2000, 2001, and that led us to a conversation about reduction opportunities. Over the next decade, that exercise and that conversation spurred us to set a long-term goal of carbon neutrality for the university, and then a short-term goal of reducing our emissions by 50% by 2020 from 2001 levels using that first inventory. So here on this slide, you can see our sort of the results of our emissions tracking for UNH over the years. And you can see, well, I don't know, it's a little tiny. I have a hard time seeing, so we'll share these slides and you can blow it up if need be. But the point of these slides is that we set a goal from a 2001 baseline to cut our emissions in half by 2020. We managed to do that through a variety of measures. And then in 2021, we published a new climate action plan, setting a new goal. And we moved our baseline year then because for a number of reasons. And we zeroed in on our scope 1 and our scope 2 emissions, our most direct emissions, when we set that new goal. But we said, okay, now we're going to try to get to 75% reductions from 2010 levels by 2030. And that's the goal we're still working on. And so this work, as I said, we've been doing it for a while. We know how important it is, and we know how hard it is, both the measurement piece and the taking action based on measurement piece. And so that has led us to some concrete reductions at UNH. And then if we go to the next slide, it also led us in a couple of different directions. It led us to dive deeply into carbon accounting. And so back, as I said, that first inventory that we did, it was before there were tools or standards published. We started talking about doing that. We started it in 1999. And that was sort of right when the global standards, the first set of global standards for carbon accounting were being developed. The first set came out in 2001 from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So as we were doing our work, we were kind of in conversation with them about standards. And then we expanded our analysis, that initial analysis that we did to publish our first comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory in 2004. That's what you see down there, the second sort of image on the bottom. And then we took that method and our process and we sort of templatized it and made it available to others. And it was an Excel workbook that we called the Campus Carbon Calculator. And I keep saying UNH partnered with the nonprofit Cleaner Cool Planet. At the time, I had recently graduated from UNH and was working at Cleaner Cool Planet, so kind of both sides. But at any rate, we did through this partnership, we made this tool available to other colleges and universities who were also working in this space. And then based on our shared efforts to understand what is our footprint and could we set goals to reduce it, hundreds of colleges and universities around the country in a network that is, I think, not unlike this SAFE network that you have, we got together and we convinced our presidents to all sign on to a carbon neutrality commitment together. And then we, meaning UNH, Cleaner Cool Planet, kept working with those universities to help them report their emissions every year, be transparent about their progress toward their goals, and report. And so then for the next decade plus, we were part of a community where we were constantly in conversation with each other about how to do the data collection, how to do the calculations, what were the data sets that were useful, how could we improve this process? And while we were doing that in other sectors, there was also many similar conversations happening, and the sort of work around carbon accounting and goal setting became professionalized. Um, and so we were also collaborating with folks in other sectors. In the teens, through all this time, UNH is working toward our own goals, and to support others with that campus carbon calculator tool. Um, in parallel at UNH, we were doing research about nitrogen and nitrogen footprints because nitrogen pollution is actually just as harmful in its own in separate ways as carbon pollution, as greenhouse gas pollution, but is less well known. Um, and many of the things that create nitrogen pollution also create carbon pollution. So the team that had been working with that campus carbon calculator to help organizations do their footprinting began collaborating with the nitrogen team, and we combined efforts to take the tools we already had, move them to an online platform, which we called SIMAP, the Sustainability Indicators Management and Analysis Platform. Um, and we launched that in 2017. So now SIMAP is has been on a publicly available platform ever since. If we go to the next slide, it's a carbon and nitrogen, as Ciara said, a tool for organizational accounting, and also for some users for annual reporting. We have hundreds of organizational subscribers. We're still disproportionately higher ed, but also businesses, nonprofits, K through 12. Organizations pay an annual subscription fee. They can add multiple users. They can export their results and their kind of metadata that was used to do their analysis. And we're continually updating and developing SIMAP based on newly available science and in collaboration with our users. And we operate it for the public good. So next slide. When we started with UNH's inventory and then the campus carbon calculator, all the tools that exist now didn't, as I said. But now there are many, many, and literally hundreds of millions of dollars in like venture capital and other investment have been funneled into tools for carbon accounting. So SIMAP is just one. They all fundamentally do the same thing. They take your activity data and multiply it by emissions factors that tell you how carbon intensive various activities are. Um, the most credible tools all generally rely on the same sets of global standards, Greenhouse Gas Protocol and others. And they're all sort of tailored. They're tailored to particular geographies or industries or sectors, to small organizations or large ones, to sort of different levels of tech adoption or budget. So often we get asked, what is the best tool? And I honestly, I find that an impossible question to answer because it's really like, what is the best for your organization? As long as it's credible, it's based on those sort of shared standards, then it's really like, is it in the languages that you need? Does it focus on the activity data that's relevant to you? Does it give you the reports that are actionable for you, etc.? For SIMAP, we really focus on scientific rigor. We're for campus-based, smaller organizations. We're all about shared learning and offering capacity for organizations who, don't have a ton of resources to put toward this, but are invested in leading. So we really operate it for the public good. And the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Ciara to talk more about carbon accounting specifics, is I'll just give a shout out. Vicky already previewed this, but one of the cool things about developing SIMAP and working in this space has been the opportunity to then develop courses and educational content based on it. We really see our role as supporting climate action by organizations and building the community of knowledgeable leaders who are going to make that happen. And so our Climate Action Clinic is an example of a program designed to do that. It's a semester long, or in the case of like this past year with Riverwoods, we ran it for a whole year with the same students and clients, which was wonderful, allowed us to do a deeper dive. But basically, we train student consultants to work in teams and support client organizations in completing their greenhouse gas inventories and then developing recommendations and conclusions. And so it's been a wonderful opportunity to learn from and with communities and organizations, like the Riverwoods community, um, and to get a feel for kind of unique strengths and challenges of those, and to help the students understand that, kind of what is transferable from organization to organization and what is really unique, and that this work is a balance of, both those things, best practices and not reinventing the wheel, but also being very context specific. So that's what I want to share by way of background, and then I'm going to pass it over to Ciara to give you some carbon accounting basics in scope 3.
Thank you, Jen. Oh, great. So it sounds like you have some familiarity with carbon footprinting already, but then also you're new. So it's going to dive into some of the basics before going into more detail about scope 3. So as Jen mentioned, she was talking about the tools, the basic greenhouse gas accounting equation is you're starting with your activity data, which is the resource use that results in emissions. In this example, that could be gallons of propane, and we're multiplying that activity data by an emission factor, or like the emissions intensity per unit of use of that resource. So in sense of gallons of propane, that's emissions of carbon dioxide per gallon. And we're multiplying that together to get the emissions released from that, or from that use. And that applies to not only like stationary fuels like propane, but also could be distance, purchased goods, and we'll get into more examples of that in a few slides. We mentioned carbon dioxide and we call it a carbon footprint, but there are multiple different greenhouse gases that are being normalized to carbon dioxide equivalents. So we mentioned metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, or MTCE. That is referring to the whole greenhouse gas footprint, not exclusively carbon dioxide. But speaking of that normalization, how do we do that? We use global warming potentials to basically account for the warming impacts of different gases relative to carbon dioxide. So since carbon dioxide is the most abundant, it's considered like the one warming. And then as seen on this table, methane, nitrous oxide have much higher global warming potentials, and they're with the emission factors that were multiplied by those GWPs to get everything in carbon dioxide equivalents, or CO2e, ECO2, CE. Also want to highlight on this table that we have both 100-year and 20-year GWPs. And the reason that's helpful is because the warming impacts of different gases have like shorter cycles in the atmosphere. So methane in particular has much more intensive warming impact atmosphere within the first 20 years after its release rather than the first 100 years. So if your institution has very methane intensive activities or that release a lot of methane, it can be helpful to look at that 20-year GWP to see what the emissions are in the short term as well as in the long 100 term. I just want to pull up the equation so you can see like what that looks like in terms of the same amount of gas for carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide multiplied by their GWPs to get that CO2e footprint. Also note that the AR6 refers to the IPCC's assessment report. The most recent one published was AR6, but we have both AR4 and AR5 in SIMAP. And with GWPs, emission factors, methodologies, we're always trying to update SIMAP to the most updated global standards and conversations. So we update emission factors annually. When new GWPs are released, we add those to SIMAP. So as Jen mentioned, we are a research-based tool. So we try to really lean into that scientific rigor and that research to make sure SIMAP give you the best possible calculations. Jen mentioned the nitrogen footprint as well, and we'll have nitrous oxide included in SIMAP. We also have other emission factors for nitrogen that's reactive in the environment but isn't a greenhouse gas. So you have the option in SIMAP to look at both your carbon footprint and what's going into the atmosphere, but then also your nitrogen footprint, how that also impacts in your environment as well. So we talked about GWP and sources. To go a bit more into that framework of how to separate different activities within your footprint, use the scopes framework to really divide up your operational boundaries into what you have control over and what's how closely related those emissions are to your institution, to your organization. So scope one are your direct emissions. They're the fuels burned in your boiler, the gasoline or diesel in vehicles owned by your organization. You have theoretically direct control over them, and they're happening in vehicles and buildings that your organization owns and operates. Scope two is the indirect emissions associated with purchased electricity. So while you technically aren't burning that electricity on at your campus, at your institution, on grounds you own, based when you turn on that light switch or that AC, that demand is impacted, is being created at the utility. So that's why it's indirect, but you tend to have more control over it because you have control of the demand used. Next category and most broad one is your scope three, which is also indirect emissions, but that's basically everything else. That's the upstream energy, commuting, food purchases, and because it's indirect, scope three is harder to manage. But get more into detail in scope three and some examples of the different methods to calculate that in a few slides. So what do you need for a complete inventory? Based on the current greenhouse gas protocol guidance, you'll always need all your scope one direct sources and all your scope two utility sources, as well as any offsets or biogenic emissions. And just to briefly define biogenic emissions, those are emissions released from burning wood chips or theoretically using a source that releases carbon that would eventually go back to the atmosphere if you're releasing it early by burning it. And then sometimes required is your scope three sources, specifically commuting, business travel, and waste, as well as other sinks like non-additional sequestration and compost. And at the time the standard came out, scope three was sometimes required because it was so much harder to calculate. We're seeing up more now. There's more of an expectation within the field across all sectors to include scope three in some cases where you can and explain what sorts are relevant. Um, there are 15 different scope three categories. We won't go through all of them today, but some examples of other common categories include purchased goods and services, investments, capital goods, and upstream transportation distribution of purchased goods. So I just talked about what you need to include in your inventory when you're creating that report or like sharing with others. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has five key like carbon accounting and reporting principles to keep in mind as you're working through that inventory. The first is relevance. You want to make sure that the inventory you're completing and then the reports you're reading about it are including everything that's relevant to your organization, all of its organizational activities. So that way it's helpful to decision makers and stakeholders to be able to use that in an actionable way. You also want it to be complete. So we just talked about what needs to be in a complete inventory, include all the relevant sources of emissions based on your institution. But you also need to, if something's not relevant, explain why it's not and justify why it's excluded. Or if there's something you can't get data from, explain why you can't do that either. Also needs to be consistent. So that means using the same methods and boundaries each year. And if something changes, in theory, going back and updating all of your inventory so that you can have a usable and valid apples to apples year to year comparison over time. You also want your reporting to be transparent. So if there are any major assumptions that were made or you had high confidence in some data, but others, it's important to include that. And it's also helpful for not only sharing it with stakeholders, whoever you're reporting to, but also documentation internally. So, you can repeat that methodology year to year. And that calls back to that level of consistency. And lastly, accuracy. That means using the same methods and the same emission factors each year. Just talked about how we SIMAP updates emission factors annually and updates GWPs and methodologies as needed. I don't know if I mentioned it yet, but the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is updating their whole suite of standards. And when that is published, we will be working at SIMAP to redesign and implement those new standards so that way your inventories are using the same methodologies and the recommended standards in the field. And so these reporting principles apply to wherever you're reporting your inventory. So website, sharing report with stakeholders, reporting to a volunteer platform, or sharing with vendors and regulators. So now doing a bit more of a scope three, deep dive into scope three bit. I've mentioned how it's a different from scopes one and two, and it's fundamentally different in some key ways. First off, it's just harder to calculate. It's much harder to get that data. With scope one and two, there's often bills associated with them, either like from a utility or from purchase records. But with scope three, you don't necessarily have a meter on all the employee cars that are driving to and from your institution. So it's harder to calculate. And because you don't have direct control, it's a lot harder to reduce or influence. If we're still using commuting as an example, you can't really demand people going to your institution switch to EVs or carpool. So it's a lot harder to not only get that data, but take action based on it. And also, scope three is always intentionally double counted or sometimes counted multiple times. And that's because your institution's scope three is someone else's scope one. With commuting as that example, it might be scope three for your institution, but for each of the commuters, since it's their vehicle, that's their scope one emissions. So they're all reasons why scope three was originally considered optional, although there's still value in it in reporting it because it is becoming easier to get that data. So then it's becoming more actionable, and now it's more expected in the field to include at least some level of scope three, if not as many categories as possible. So because scope three is hard to calculate, there are multiple different methods to address that. The basic underlying calculation is the same as scope one and two, activity data times emission factor to get emissions. So depending on the data you have available, there are multiple different methods for getting to that. And those include the average spend-based method, the average unit-based method, and the supplier-specific method. So with the average spend-based method, you're multiplying the dollars you spent on a particular activity or resource and multiplying it by an emission factor that has emissions per dollar spent to get your greenhouse gas emissions estimate. And most inventory tools will already have spend-based emission factors built in. For SIMAP, for our spend-based factors, we use the U.S. Environmentally Extended Input-Output model that was previously released by the EPA, but is now maintained by the Cornerstone Data Sustainability Initiative, a partnership with Stanford and Watershed. And essentially what this database does is it looked at national data sets for different industry sector categories and then aggregated that data by spend to get an emissions per dollar for across multiple different categories. So in this table, there's some examples of like hotels and motels, construction, computer manufacturing. There's over 1,000 different categories within that data set. So you have a lot of different options to choose how to categorize specific spend. That can be a lot in and of itself. So there you have different recommendations for how to get started with that data. And we actually just released earlier this month the updated version 1.4 to SIMAP, which uses the same categories, but now uses 2023 emission factors with 2024 US dollars. So they're updating that data set. We're updating it as needed so that we can get the best possible estimate. And since spend data can vary so much depending on vendor, where you're located, taxes, inflation over time, we do have inflation factors built into SIMAP, but there's a lot more uncertainty with spend-based. So we usually recommend using spend-based to get sort of an order of magnitude estimate to start from, and then to use that to try and get to a unit-based method for specific categories. And speaking of the unit-based method, for the average unit-based method, you're using, instead of dollars, a quantity of the resource use and an average emission factor for that particular activity to get that set of emissions. So that can look like pounds, gallons, or miles of something purchased or an activity multiplied by an emission factor that matches that unit to get those emissions. And similar to spend-based emission factors, most greenhouse gas inventory tools will already have unit-based emission factors built in, at least for some categories. So within SIMAP, as an example, we have unit-based emission factors for food purchases. So you can upload weight-based food data using kilograms, pounds, or US gallons. Similar to purchasing, you do have to assign them to the appropriate categories to get the appropriate emission factors to be used for that. We have multiple different category options in SIMAP, but this is an example that can look like fruits, apples, vegetables, or meats, beef. And since you do purchase a lot of food and food purchases tend to be a significant portion or just like a lot of data to work with, Rebecca Grecken from Stanford created the Taste Food tool, which can quickly, easily, and accurately categorize your food purchases and then create it in or create an export that can easily be uploaded to SIMAP. So you can easily process, categorize, and add to SIMAP to get a graph of your not only weight of food purchased, but also the emissions associated with them. So we highly recommend the tool Taste Food for processing your food emissions, your food categorization to get to your food emissions. And now I'll pass it back to Jen to talk more about the supplier-specific methods.
Yeah, I'll just wrap us up here. So as Ciara said, you're starting all of this upstream and downstream analysis using kind of average emissions factors based on your activity data. And you're doing that to try to understand, okay, what are the portions of your upstream or downstream activities that are sort of inherently more carbon intensive or that are such a large part of your day-to-day operations that focusing on them makes sense. Either way, we're doing those sort of average unit-based calculations to understand where should we focus more effort in reductions and also analysis. And so in some cases, food is a great example of where for communities like yours, the food you purchase and serve in the residence halls likely is a significant part of your footprint. I'm sorry, not residence halls, dining facilities. You can tell I'm used to campus. Um, and one way to reduce that footprint is to choose foods that are just sort of inherently less carbon intensive, eating lower on the food chain. But once you get to a point where people are going to eat what they're going to eat, or you're going to need to build what you're going to need to build, because building is another typically carbon intensive activity, then that's when you really need to get down to a supplier specific level of analysis, because then your options for reductions are really working with suppliers or partners who are themselves trying to lower their emissions so they can give you the lower emissions version of the thing that you need to buy or do. Um, and so there's two different supplier specific methods. One of them is sort of the emissions intensity. One looks at the emissions intensity of the entire organization. And the other looks at the emissions intensity of a specific thing that they provide or sell. So, for example, if you're looking at the emissions associated with business travel, you could do a supplier specific analysis that is looking at, okay, we booked through Delta. What is the carbon intensity of Delta versus American Airlines? Or you could do a supplier specific analysis that is for all the flights from, Boston to DC on Friday mornings, what are the least carbon intensive? That's based on their equipment and their lots of things. So to do that analysis, you either need published information from your supplier about how carbon intensive they are overall. And then you can sort of figure out per dollar of sales, what does that mean for you in terms of I spent $100 with them? What's the carbon intensity of spending $100 with this company? Or again, you could do the sort of product level analysis of they've looked at what are the emissions associated with this exact flight, this exact thing. And you have an emissions factor for the number of those things that you do. So the sort of two sub methods under this supplier specific method. Go to the next slide. We're almost in here. So again, just to sort of sum up the range of scope 3 methods, really you've got an average bucket and a supplier specific bucket, and each of those have two different ways in, either kind of spend or unit based, org or product based. And you can do the animation, Ciara. Thank you. As you kind of move, you sort of start on the left hand side because that spend data is the easiest to get. And then you sort of identify your hotspots, and then you focus in on those hotspots with more granular analysis, which is going to be it's going to be harder to do, but that's going to be the thing that's going to then allow you to set a reduction target and track progress over time. Next slide. And so uh, hopefully kind of obvious from the explanations of these, but pros and cons of each of them. For the average spend base, it's relatively easy to get the activity data you need, and we have good emissions factors databases now. But it's very average. Again, as Ciara said, it's very order of magnitude. So the unit-based tends to be a little bit more exact and useful, but harder to get all the data you need. And still an average. And so then you're sort of moving to those supplier specific methods, which have the benefit of being the most accurate and granular and allow you to track progress over time, but also just much more resource and time intensive and not as readily available in different tools. Um, so that is what we wanted to share with you about Scope 3. This is the list of the 15 categories that have been defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And in terms of where to start, purchased and capital goods, categories 1 and 2 tend to be good starting places. And then historically, many organizations have also looked at commuting and business travel and waste because they have good activity data, and those are very kind of tangible activities that you understand, you can see the results of, and you can do engagement around. So that is our sort of scope 3 summary. Last thing I want to say is that we do have some resources that go into much deeper detail about all of the kind of hows and whys built into SIMAP. These are publicly available even if you don't have a subscription. So we've got trainings and frequently asked questions and a user guide. Ciara does office hours that you can just book. She's got standing office hours every week. And we do an online footprinting certificate that sort of as we were doing here, we present a lot of material, but then we make space to kind of workshop and talk about it as well. And we also have a demo account that any or all of you could use if you wanted to just kind of look at SIMAP and play with it a little. You could log in with this login information and look around. And we'll make sure we'll leave this with you so you have it. So that's what we had. And now I think would love to hear from you all, your questions or reflections. Thank you again.
Thank you. That has been incredibly eye-opening and useful. I just learned a ton. Okay, so first question.
Yes, it seems to me when you use the spend-based method, you're incentivized to lower the price and not the greenhouse gas content of the product, and therefore you are penalized if you spend more for a green premium product.
Yes, which is one of the reasons why we really encourage folks to use the spend-based method to understand where are the places where they need better data. And then go ahead and move to the average unit-based or the supplier-specific method in those spaces. So if you're spending money for premium sustainability products, the supplier-specific method would be a great option because it's the whole point of you paying the premium is that the emissions factor is lower than the kind of average one. So then the challenge there is to connect with your supplier or find their published information to try to understand, okay, well, either can they give you a specific emissions factor or can they give you information about how much less carbon intensive than average they are? And then you could kind of figure that out for yourself. But we definitely don't recommend using spend-based if you're using spend-based, your numbers are not accurate. Your numbers are directional. They're telling you is where do you need to do more digging. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got two questions. One is, as emission factors are adjusted or improved, does this automatically go back and recalculate the emissions from your baseline year and all previous years?
Yeah. Ciara, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yes. So when we go to update all the emission factors in SIMAP, we not only get additional years worth of data, but we're updating that entire suite of emission factors. And we do that a lot because of the data that's available. There's an inherent lag in the calculations. So you might be working on your 2025 inventory right now, but the most recently available data is from 2023. So you're going to be using 2023 data or 2023 emission factors, excuse me, with 2025 data to get like a temporary estimate for now. But then 2 years from now, when they publish the data for 2025, when we update SIMAP, we'll be updating those previous emission factors. So all of the ones in that set to then update all of your previous inventories. So right now we have the 2025 version of emission factors on SIMAP. So that doesn't mean you only have emission factors for 2025. It means we've updated that entire suite. And that's why we have it versioned, is so it's not we're adding an additional year, but we're adding updated methodologies, updated emission factors for the entire set. So when you're using a particular version, you know the most recent emission factors are being applied to all of the data in your account.
Okay, so my actual energy use for 2019 may not change, but my baseline carbon footprint might change because of improved data, right? Emission factors.
It might, yeah.
Okay. And my second question is something that's just troubled me. Maybe it's just an observation, or maybe there's something more that can be said about it. Is functions that are arbitrarily either scope 1 or scope 3. I know some campuses, CCRCs, and other campuses, all their landscaping work is done in-house by employees. And exactly the same work at our campus is done by contractors. So it's scope 3.
Right.
And it seems to me those are some of the scope 3 things to focus on early, but it also makes it difficult. It makes it difficult to compare campuses.
Yeah.
And it underlines the importance of defining exactly where your boundary line is when you report any carbon footprint number. I don't know if you can add anything more to that.
Yes. Well, a couple things. Going back to the sort of emission factor in baseline year changes. As Ciara said, one of the reasons, like we do version our emission factor data set so that it's not as though you're going to magically see your numbers change and never be able to go back and see what they were before. You could go back and look at them. You could carry those emissions factors forward if you wanted to sort of see how do we compare using those same methods. But what the greenhouse gas protocol recommends is if you have meaningfully different or better data, you do go back and restate your baseline. You either move your baseline year or restate your baseline year emissions. Once you get a few years out, for most things, it's not going to change unless it's a space where the methods are still very meaningfully evolving, which scope 3 is one of those spaces, right? What I want to say about the really good point you made about boundaries is like this is the interplay between the operational boundaries, which are the scopes, and the organizational boundaries, which are about what am I counting as in boundary or out of boundary. And the reason that there's been one good reason why there's been a shift toward requiring or strongly encouraging complete scope 3 reporting is to try to get at exactly that issue of if you don't have to do scope 3 and you're setting your organizational boundaries different, then you can never meaningfully compare your footprint.
And you can outsource all your pollution.
Exactly. But if you do have to report scope 3, and again, many jurisdictions are like moving toward that or trying to move toward that. Ciara, do you mind pulling that slide back up with the scope 3 categories, please? There are 2 categories in scope 3, right, that are intended to get at exactly that, the upstream, well, it's either purchased goods or services, or the upstream and downstream leased assets, so that if you're like, well, we lease out that space, right, it's still in there too. And so the way I think for this organization and for benchmarking, the first thing is to make sure everybody has a really clear understanding of that if there are subcategories of purchased goods or services, or if there's a sort of preponderance of a lot of upstream or downstream leased assets that are going to change the footprint, that everybody agrees we're going to include scope 3 reporting for those 3. as part of our required reporting. And then yeah, it's still a little bit hard if you're trying to compare category by category, but you at least know that you are preventing some of that leakage, right? Some of that outsourcing of pollution by trying to get people to have it all represented in their footprint, even if they are making a distinction between, well, we outsource that, so it's not in boundary. We have less control over how that happens. It's still reflecting the fact that it is happening as a result of your need to operate, right? So, so yes, I think it's a problem, and I think required scope 3 reporting and a clear kind of understanding within the community of where those especially important use cases are and where they would show up in these scope 3 categories.
And it may mean
Have that shared understanding, you can address that.
with your contract with the landscape, for that example, requiring them to provide data on their fuel use and their waste generation or whatever it is.
Exactly. Yeah. Then you're moving to that supplier specific method for a subset of your purchase goods and services. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead. Other questions?
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. I think I finally understand scope 3 in a way I didn't before. So thank you.
Yep.
Yay, thank you.
Just a quick comment. Our maintenance department outsources landscaping and wrote into the contract this year, thank God, that the people cleaning up the lawns will have to use electric leaf blowers and weed whackers. And they didn't get into the lawnmowers yet, but that's coming, I suspect. So there is some power that we're the biggest biggest person that this contractor has, so that we have some clout with them. My question actually, and I guess I can go to Taste Food and look that up, but those terrific charts of how what the greenhouse gas emissions are for different categories of food. And I noticed that about half, as one would expect, has to do with flesh. Beef was the biggest. The thing that surprised me was that pork was smaller than chicken and fish was just a little bit. And is that per pound of flesh, or is it, do you know how that's calculated? As I say, I can go and look at Taste Food, I suppose.
Well, and actually those graphics were generated in SIMAP. In SIMAP, we have a food report that is intentionally trying to help make it easy to kind of make that point. Like eating lower on the food chain helps always. And so we could share with you the specific emissions factors. The emissions factors are in emissions intensity per, I think, kilogram of.
Okay, so it's per weight. So that
per weight,
the fact that half of that chart was flesh is meaningful.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. You by becoming a vegan, you could basically cut your scope 3 carbon emission from food in half.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And like I said, that's part of why we did that visualization. And what we don't want is for it to be like, no, everybody needs to go vegan. But even if if you switch 10%, like it will have a disproportionate impact. And that's really what we were trying to help people visualize and communicate to their people.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Your answer to the last question is helping me a little bit. I want to ask a really basic question, I guess, which the complexity, I haven't looked at your demos and all that stuff, but it looks like the complexity of doing the whole SIMAP thing and getting your whole carbon footprint, it looks to me like the kind of thing we would need a paid sustainability employee to gather all that data and fill all that out. It strikes me that our pretty overworked executive leadership team and residents are not necessarily in a position to do all that documenting. My sense of where to start is with areas where we know there's issues. We know that we need that cutting down on meat is going to make a difference. So maybe we try and use the food part of it to measure that. I mean, I could see ways to take components to work on areas that for various reasons we think we can pragmatically target and move forward on. Can you comment on this? Because it feels kind of overwhelming, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, you're not alone. And yeah, definitely like the whole new industry has sprung up of people having who that this is their job. Um, and I think that idea of really targeting or, kind of bite-sized stuff makes a ton of sense. And that's one of the reasons why for a long time it was like, just do scope 1 and 2. You have utility bills anyway. That's pretty, you have that data. Um, but for the scope 3 stuff, like the community engagement stuff, I don't know if maybe being able to trade notes with communities that have done this analysis, but I think we now know what some of the hot spots are. Food is definitely one, capital expenditures is another. So I think kind of cherry picking and doing it piece by piece is good. And the last thing I'll say is that's also part of the reason why we offer things like the Climate Action Clinic so that you can have some students work on it. It's a good student project. If your staff has just enough bandwidth to help funnel data to them, then it's on them to ask the right questions about the data, and we can help with that.
Just one follow-up. What did you mean by the capital expenses is a hot spot?
Oh, like building or renovating buildings, or equipment, like big vehicles, renovations,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And you're putting that in scope 3?
Because it's a purchase good or service. Yeah.
Yes, two quick questions. One, do you weather normalize emissions based on degree days and humidity?
Ciara, do you want to take that?
Yes, we do have the ability to normalize by degree days in SIMAP.
Do you take into account humidity also, or just degree days?
Just degree days at this point. And the way we have it set up is we have like a normalizations menu, or as like a drop-down option on our results tab. So you can calculate your emissions and then like select normalize by degree day and adjust there. And it will give you that emissions by degree day based on the zip code you've entered for your institution. So yes, we do have it normalized by degree day, or is possible. We don't have it by humidity at this point.
Okay, thanks. The other question is, if your intention is to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions and not compare yourself to others, it doesn't really matter how you classify your emissions. Is that correct?
Uh,
I mean, if your bottom line is I want to reduce
only
my
internal. If it's only internal, then I would agree with you. If you're
okay,
publishing it, I would think it would be important to use the shared taxonomy because otherwise, how can it be meaningful to
yes,
external?
no, I'm just thinking internally.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Back to food. I think we're all at institutions with institutional kitchens that make major purchases from major institutional food suppliers. Isn't there some way to take the invoice and crank it through? I mean, this is, 10 cans of peaches and this is 500 pounds of beef, and crank it through. I mean, how else do you do that?
Yeah, that's what that taste food tool that Ciara was talking about. That's what that was designed to do, is to kind of process those line item invoices. And many of the big food companies, institutional food companies, are working on internal tools and processes as well because many of their clients are asking them to do that. So I think there's sort of multiple ways into that. But even with those tools, I'm not gonna lie, an endeavor. It's useful. It is an endeavor.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.